And now I'll move on to the call, the Gibson telephone call that was intercepted on November 23rd, 1963, the day after the assassination in Switzerland, where Gibson was. And reading from this document, Swiss federal police informed that delicate source furnished conversation in French between unknown individual and Richard Thomas Gibson as follows. Now, they give the call. It was in French. They give the French, but there's also a translation in one of the documents given here. Unknown individual, sincere condolence just the same. Richard Gibson. Ah, yes, and this also. The guy was one of ours. He is a nut. I was exchanging correspondence with him. He is a nut, a former Marine, and they're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald here. This may have unbelievable consequences. Yes, I am not unhappy either, but this is not the way whereby minds can be changed. You understand now, if they want to engage in a campaign to invade Cuba, there are no longer any problems. It is very serious. Yes, but also is a fellow who was called to my attention 2 years ago because he was arrested for having shouted "Long live Fidel" in the streets of Dallas, Texas. There was quite a hubbub at the time. He wrote letters to me and became a member of the committee. For Cuba? Yes, I have a radio set here. Mention has already been made of our committee. Think of it. Poor Vincent T. Lee in New York. This must be terrible. He is not. He is in hot water. And also for Tabor. For Tabor, it says Kibor. And everybody. I am very happy I am here. I am glad to say we are not going to be involved in interrogations. There is nothing to... For example, all this correspondence has been destroyed for some time now. I have burned everything. And he's talking about his correspondence with Lee Harvey Oswald. After this telephone call was intercepted, there are communications among the CIA people mostly, where they're expressing a great interest in Gibson. But it's not until this document here, it's a December 19th, 1963 document, but it's a report of an interview with Gibson on December 9th, and I'm going to read that. Mr. Darwin Curtis, CIA, Paris, advised on December 19th, 1963, that Richard Gibson was interviewed by Mr. John Gossett, Acting Consul General, American Embassy, Paris, on December 9th, 1963. Mr. Gossett reported as follows. Now, this is in France. Gibson had gone to France after the call from Switzerland. 1. That he had no correspondence with or knowledge of Oswald as Lee Harvey Oswald. That he did, however, recall receiving in the late summer of 1962 a letter from Fort Worth from a man who signed his name Lee Beaumont, indicating an interest in organizing a Fair Play for Cuba committee in Fort Worth and enclosing a Fort Worth newspaper clipping, including a photograph of himself concerning some activity or other in that general field. Mr. Gibson said that to the best of his memory, Beaumont received a routine reply enclosing some literature. Gibson had no further correspondence with Beaumont. Gibson himself left the U.S. in September 1962. Although he had no reason at the time to believe that Beaumont was a pseudonym, he now thinks that Beaumont might have been Oswald. Gibson pointed out that the FPCC received many letters and visits from cranks, some of whom, of course, used pseudonyms. I asked him at this point if he thought it possible that in replying to Beaumont he might have given him the name of someone already active for the FPCC in Fort Worth area for Beaumont to get in touch with, which would give us a further lead. Gibson said no, he was fairly sure that they did not, because in the South and the Southwest at that time virtually the only workers for the FPCC were Negroes. That in that region, they would, of course, avoid putting a Southern white in contact with their Negro leadership, and that Beaumont was obviously, from his letter, a Southern white. Gibson did not recall that they had anyone in Fort Worth at that time anyway. 2. Gibson said that in the summer of 1962, the New York offices of the FPCC were visited by a Trotskyist group, a Socialist Workers' Party, Gibson, for some reason which was not clear to me, seemed to feel that Oswald may have visited their headquarters with this Trotskyist group. I suspect Oswald's pictures look familiar to Gibson. Gibson went on to say that some of the Trotskyist types, who were rather vocally irresponsible on matters of direct action, could well, without intending to, have planted in Oswald's mind the idea that assassination had merit. He greatly doubts, however, that they would have deliberately or consciously have encouraged Oswald to such action. I find that I have not been able to decide in my own mind the extent of Gibson's truthfulness on this subject. I lean to the belief that what he said was true insofar as it went, that he himself would not be capable of in any way condoning presidential assassination as a political tool in America, and that he is probably not withholding information which he himself feels is of possible use or significance in the investigation. Nevertheless, I think he might be withholding some additional bit of information that could indicate a more direct past communication with Oswald on his part. So we seem to have two different stories here, one from the intercepted telephone call and one from Gibson's interview with the acting consul general in Paris, as relayed to us by Darwin Curtis of the CIA. And we should compare the story, I think. On the phone call, Gibson said he was exchanging correspondence with Oswald, and when he talks to the acting consul general, he's talking as if he just sent one letter and one letter came back. No further correspondence, not all this correspondence. So there seems to be a lot of correspondence that Gibson is talking about in the telephone call, and very little when he goes on the record. In the telephone call, he says 2 years ago, and that's in 1963, so 2 years ago would be 1961. In the interview with the consul, he says 1962, late summer of 1962. And on the telephone call, he says Dallas, and in the interview, he says Fort Worth. And also in the telephone call, he says, all this correspondence has been destroyed. I have burned everything, which is not at all the sense that you get from his interview with the acting consul. So, and when you look at the phone call, and the CIA had this information, you would think they would be very interested in reconciling what he said in the phone call with what he said later. And there's no mention anywhere of them doing that. And it's very incriminating sounding in the phone call, saying he's burned all the correspondence. And if they know both stories, as the CIA did know both stories, they would realize that something's wrong here. The stories don't match. Now, the next document I'm going to deal with was released twice, as you can see here, once in 2017 and once in 2018. That has the same record number. One version was redacted, and one version, the redaction has been removed, and we can see what was said. And here I've put side by side the portion that was redacted in 2017 and unredacted in 2018. And I'll read that part in yellow there. I could go back and check. I'll first note that this is starting in the middle of a thought of some kind. So not only was it redacted, but it's incomplete, and it's still incomplete in 2018. I could go back and check. The only thing I do need, as I say, I can't read that, is a better cover than I have. That could be varied as I went along. Fortunately, we would hope that not too many people are going to compare the story. And then the other thing, the final thing, he's going on to a different thought here. So this first part is what I'm interested in. And I have it underlined here. Fortunately, we hope that not too many people are going to compare the story. And so we have him starting, and they're writing down what Gibson said. These is notes from debriefing of Gibson. And so, what story are they talking about? What story is he talking about that he hopes nobody compares? Well, I think it's this story. the story I'm comparing. That is the story from the phone call versus the story from his interview. They don't match up, and I think he's talking about that same story, though I can't prove it. But if I'm right, this shows complicity between the CIA and Richard Gibson, that his story doesn't match. That is, the story he told first doesn't match the official story. And he and the CIA are working together, and the CIA knows all about these stories not matching, and they're happy with Gibson because they employ him for several years after this. Maybe they're not happy with him, but they do employ him for several years after this. And they know the first story doesn't match the second story, and they probably know the second story is false, that the first story is more close to the truth. And now I want to bring up this document again, which I mentioned in another video. September 11th, 1962, an FBI document, sort of. It's the CIA and the FBI working together here, but talking about a letter that Gibson had written to a brother or a stepbrother of someone who used to work for the CIA when he's trying to get in contact with the CIA. Says of that letter, in the letter, Gibson asked Haggart to tell Rice to inform Rice's former employers, the CIA, that he, Gibson, had written a letter several weeks ago discreetly trying to get in touch with the agency. Time was running out. It was a matter of life or death. Now, we shouldn't think that it's a matter of life or death for Richard Gibson personally, because he's holding out for money. He doesn't want to work for the FBI unless they pay him, and they end up not paying him. And if it was his own life that was at stake, I think he would work for free to save his life. So Gibson is talking about something that's a matter of life and death to somebody else, and he's the head of the FPCC. So I think this means that Gibson has a particular story to tell about life and death, and I think it involves someone in the FPCC, and it probably is Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is the end of this is September 62, and this is the period where, by the second story at least, he says that he had been in contact with Oswald or Beaumont in the summer of 62. And this is the end of the summer of 62. And in a telephone call, he said it was 2 years ago, but that's something he might just get wrong in the telephone call. Maybe it was in the summer of 62. And maybe it was Oswald, and maybe Oswald was talking about killing somebody, and that's why it's a matter of life and death. And that would also explain why he destroyed all his correspondence with Oswald, why he burned everything, because Oswald was talking about assassinating somebody. So I think right before he says, fortunately, we would hope that not too many people are going to compare the story, I think prior to this, in the missing section, we don't have here that he's been talking about his history of correspondence with Lee Harvey Oswald. The CIA knows about that, and they know that Gibson knows about that. And so the CIA, I think, is partially motivated to employ Gibson because Gibson wants to be employed, and they want him to stay quiet about what he knows about Oswald. So I think they hire him because they want to keep the Oswald secret. They don't want anybody reading the documents to realize that if the CIA had engaged Gibson in 1962, that Oswald could have been arrested and dealt with before he even had a chance to shoot Kennedy. And I'm not saying he did shoot Kennedy, but what I'm saying is that this would look very bad for the CIA. So they're very motivated to keep Gibson under control. Gibson wants to work for them. Gibson does have access to all these lefty groups, so I think that's why they employ him. But I don't think they like him very much. And if you read his personnel file, you can see they're very suspicious of him all the time. They don't really trust him, but they employ him anyway. And I think this is why, to keep the Oswald secret. So that's why I think the telephone call is what changed the CIA's mind about Gibson. When they heard that call, they knew they had to do something, and they ended up hiring Richard T. Gibson.